Today, we're joined by Jaren Glover, who was an early engineering hire at Robinhood and helped scale the infrastructure team as well as just the broader Robinhood team over his time there. And we're super excited to dive into some of the lessons he's learned about how to build really high power engineering teams. So, to kick things off, Jaren, when you're working with startups and founders, what are the areas you find you're typically able to be most helpful with, given your past experiences?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think a lot of my high leverage comes from the empathy of what it takes to build a complex company, engineering organization. Everything isn't up and to the right, so I tend to have a ton of empathy for the process of going from zero to one, the process of the engineering and scaling pains that go with that. And so a lot of the tools in my toolkit kind of arrive from kind of either building some of the most, like how do you hire your first engineer? Like how do you think about your first term sheet? Negotiating your first term sheet? How do you think about when it's time to introduce your next first managers? When it's time to fire that first manager? Or just like the natural things of, trade-offs about what it is to kind of build a company. I tend to have a lot of empathy from that perspective. What I don't do is actually just as important as what I do is that I tend to not to give product advice. I like to tell the CEOs that I work with, if you need me for your product advice, we're both like SOL. So I'm outsourcing that to you. I'm not one of those ex-operators who thinks that he can kind of grab the wheel. I think for me, my job is to kind of put the CEO or co-founders into a positive feedback loop and kind of hold them accountable of being the best version of themselves. And I think one of the nice things of working at a company that work is that I know what like exceptionalism look like, so I can kind of help the founder think through like, hey, am I actually operating? I say I want to be the next Dropbox or the next Zuck or the next Vlad. Then how do I kind of get that?
Awesome. To kick things off, let's maybe dive into a little bit of that experience at Robinhood. So you joined back in 2016. What was the team like? What was the state of engineering? And how did you see that sort of grow over the past years?
Yeah. When I got there January 2016, it was fintech wasn't cool just yet. I remember every VC I talked to at that point in time just thought that Robinhood wouldn't be a big business. It was like I would talk to 99 VCs and they'd be like, Jaren, what are you doing with your time, right? That was super interesting. They either had the wrong context or the wrong perspective. They either had too much context or not enough context to be excited about the opportunity. When I joined, there was about 40 people. The infrastructure team was basically the second hire and then the first hire. And so I was either the second hire or third hire, depending on how you defined it. And we were like 40 people, 20 engineers, 29 engineers. I think we had about 150,000 users, one product. The kind of the state of the world from an infrastructure perspective was Sentry, OpenTSB, a lot of EC2 compute, a lot of using AWS managed services. And it was a pretty fascinating time because when I left in April of last year, there were 22 million users, five or six products, 2,000 employees. So that kind of gives you a grasp of kind of the scale that happened in 5.5 years.
Amazing. Definitely a super exciting growth trajectory and time to experience the company. I'd love to hear a little bit more about maybe what was an unexpected learning from growing a team at both that speed and scale.
I think the unexpected lesson to learn is hiring engineers is very hard, especially in today's environment. But hiring infrastructure engineers who have the ability to operate at the scale that we needed, because we're dealing with people money, which we take particularly seriously. The natural scale that was compounding, each person that was on the team had a lot of responsibility and scope. And I think turns out that persona was very hard to hire for because a lot of those individuals are like locked up into Google and Facebook and they're making more money than God. And so they're not ready to kind of take the leap of faith, or they're actually ready to take the leap of faith, but actually they were so far away from the metal that they would get to where we were at in startup land and kind of drown in the abyss. And so I think the hiring is just really hard and really focusing. When you're not hiring, you should be hiring, keeping that pipeline particularly rich. And so I think that was one of the big things that was really interesting to learn from. It was interesting hiring from some of the other engineers was much easier than for the particular persona that we had. I think the lesson to be learned there was that I think we should have made it easier to onboard less experienced people into the platform, because what happened was we are trying to find a needle in the haystack, trying to hire another Marco or Arvin, two of my colleagues. when we should have been trying to hire a new, John, who's a new grad, and and create the safe area and the guardrails for them to be able to onboard and grow and evolve like that. And so I think that's a few things. Hiring's already hard. You should probably create an environment that allows for new grads to introduce into the environment. And then third, startups is hard. I think everyone kind of glorifies like as if like, growth just compounding comes from the sky, users fall from the sky. There's a lot of like abyss walking around the abyss and a lot of hard work. And there's like no shortcuts. There's no like TikTok growth hack. There's just like great engineers, great people showing up every day to be obsessive about kind of their customers, their goals, and their colleagues, and kind of doing the work. There was a lot of late nights and early mornings. Turns out the stock market opens at 6 a.m. PST time, and if you're working to 2 p.m., then it's tough cookies. But I think there's just no. I think a lot of people underestimate how hard it actually takes to build something of value.
How did you think about building your interview questions and panels to evaluate for that really high caliber of talent that you were looking for?
So the thing I think a lot about was what I really hated was interview loops that were not rooted in reality, right? Interview loops, what algorithm would it take to stick how many balls in an airplane is not really relevant nor important, I think, from the perspective. And I didn't think like data structures or algorithms was that important either. I mean, I don't know what a bubble sort is today, but I can scale a pretty complex distributed system. I think that it's something special about a interview loop. Like there's kind of like two big pieces of an interview loop: kind of the screener, and then the kind of the on-site, as they would call it, back in the day, pre-COVID. I think the screener should be rooted in like real world, like what is a day-to-day life at the point in time, which this isn't the case anymore. But one of the things I really liked about a screener was it was like this metric collection exercise. It was like a basic Python. You can kind of solve this problem with Golang, Python, Bash, even Bash. And it was like this really interesting thing where you can make a network request collection and like loops. So super basic construct, but either you saw or you didn't saw it. So it was extremely high signal. I remember when we had the interview, it was so high signal that if someone chose Python and didn't import requests, they wasn't gonna make it. And so that was great because it was extremely real world. Like I was doing that every day. The screener was really important, and the on-site was like the way we structured was architecture, project deep dive, and then a kind of a coding exercise. But basically, you had to spike in the project deep dive was super important because you need to be able to communicate with your peers and complex. Like it turns out, you can be really great engineer, but if you can't work with someone, it's not really good exercise. You could cure cancer, but if you couldn't explain to me how we cure cancer, that's not that really important. So the project deep dive was pretty interesting, and then it really allowed for you to get the depthness of an individual candidate, and then you can either spike either from an architecture perspective or a coding perspective. And for me, I didn't care which one; just you need to spike in one of those other ones. And so I think we kind of got that right. I think the thing we got wrong was that our interview process was very stagnant. And I wish our interview process would been, I think what happened, you get one that you really like and it just stays like that for 6 months, 8 months. And I think you just got to be constantly involved in it because there's like holes and gaps and looking at the data. And then what you want to do is kind of have a nice, great recruiter and sourcer who's kind of holding you accountable, and you view them as peers that helping you source, trying to ask tough questions about why people are dropping out of the interview process, et cetera, et cetera. I think we got a real world rooted and real world interview process. I wish we would have got a take home assignment. I really like the interviews that had take home assignments. We never got there, but I always admire the companies who did. And then two, just constantly be evolving it because just tweaking and only tweaking one knob at a time. But I think those are the things that were really good and things I wish we would have got right.
So now you have an exceptional new hire, they're joining the team. How do you think about onboarding them and setting them up for success?
I was so obsessive about onboarding and hiring because what happens is that 30, 60, 90 is going to tell you everything you need to know about that particular candidate. I kind of take the Netflix mantra of, we're a high performing NFL team. And if you're not performing, we just see you on the service and go home. And I think what happens is when you don't have a great onboarding exercise, you don't know if it's the individual or your process that's causing them to flounder. It's really hard to kind of really know whether or not someone isn't working and you should rip off the band-aid or you just have a bad process. One of the things I used to really like to do is kind of not like, mentor, like accountability, having someone tie up with them, kind of pair programming, working on projects, define scope. I used to say like you want to create a beachhead for a candidate and kind of build out from that. And that's so it goes from like small tasks that take a day to a week and like build out right there and build up their confidence. And what happens is they get those W's, so those wins, and those wins really build up their confidence and then their trust along the way. And they get access broaden out from that perspective. What would happen is there's no correlation about who needs that hand holding. No matter if they were the nth engineer at Facebook or the nth engineer at Google, turns out what made them successful at their previous job didn't necessarily mean that they're going to be successful in this current job. And gosh, let me tell you, the number of flounders I had from like insert your favorite tech company was pretty embarrassing, frankly. So there's like no signal, and so everyone needs to go through that process, no matter how senior, whether it be a new grad or L7 engineer, because navigating on your rails are much different. Just being pretty thoughtful. I think this actually is the responsibility of the engineering manager, and so the engineering manager job is to kind of manage the onboarding process and making sure that that new grad or new hire has a mentor, and that mentor's responsibility is to craft that story and onboarding. And what we would see later is funny because you would see someone 9 months after they hire, and the quality of that individual was directly correlated with the mentor that onboarded that person. And so we could see like, oh, people were not performing that well, you can kind of point to their mentor and be like, something's going on here. Or there were organizations who had better onboarding exercises. That was probably the most interesting thing there. And I'm relentless, 30, 60, 90. These gray hairs are a byproduct of going from 150,000 users to 22 million and bad hires. I worked very hard. And so I was not very empathetic for people who didn't show up at work and kind of brought it every day. And I think kind of being objective and fair is pretty important because when you're high cadence engineering organization, everyone reverts to the mean. So you need to make sure you're careful and everyone is aware of like who's actually delivering, not delivering.
Yeah, you touch on a really good point there around sort of what you value and what you recognize as like success in a high performing engineer. How did you think about sort of codifying that? Were engineering levels a part of this? Was it informal culture in terms of how you like rewarded people and incentivized them? How did you basically think about creating structure there?
I think I don't know if I don't know if I was particularly well at that, to be quite honest. I think we got lucky that the first in hires were just amazing on my team. I was just like, I'm to this day, I'm like, I wouldn't be the engineer that I was without those individuals. When I talk to CTOs, I'm always kind of particularly hyper aware to that first engineering hire. So a lot of people I work with, especially if they're like Series B, Series C companies, a lot of my value add is helping them think around the corner when they hire their first VP of Eng. I actually sometimes delaying that because sometimes people think they need a VP of Eng, but they actually don't. What they really need is like their first line of managers. That first line of engineering managers is going to make or break an engineering organization. And it's kind of the responsibility that, and oftentimes what happens is either the first engineer or second engineer that transitions into that. It's not always that good. Or also there's just a great engineer who's done a lot of great work, so has the respect of his or her peers, so therefore they get promoted to engineering manager. And that's like a pretty critical high inflection time for a engineering organization. Getting that right before kind of introducing more layers is so important. And it's kind of their responsibility because like being an exceptional IC individual contributor is way different than being a successful engineering manager. A lot of the work and space that I kind of do and a lot of my gray hairs was that transition or the first VP of Eng wasn't very successful and like holding kind of trying to get that right because likely my guess is that you have already hired amazing individual contributors that can ship way better code than I ever could. But that is the magic of because like there's a saying, I don't know who said it, but said that every time an organization doubles, it breaks. And it's the engineering organization management role job to kind of protect that. Or, well, actually, you can't stop it from breaking. That's the secret. It's going to break. The job of a great leader, engineering leader, and engineering managers to make sure it doesn't that when it does break, it comes back together quickly, and you're aware of the breakage and things at the seams. I mean, at the end of the day, I think incentives matter, and I think that the founder's responsibility is to set what matters and reward those incentives matter. And I always say if the founder doesn't care, then no one cares. And so it starts at the top. And then two, I think incentives matter, which you reward. If you're not careful, if you're a very big product, or the product engineers are rewarded, but not the reliability engineers, right? Or maybe your API, so your reliability engineers are being rewarded and your product engineers are not. And so thinking through a lot of the incentives there are just so, so important. And I think it starts at the top, and what people like, whatever you reward people for, either explicitly or implicitly, will naturally come through, and people will kind of revert to that.
Definitely. I want to go a bit deeper on something you touched on there around inflection points and introducing different levels of management. I think as a founder CTO, that's something I spend a lot of time thinking about is like, how are you planning ahead to make sure that you have those right management resources in place? Because really great managers can enable a team to just operate at a much higher level, right? But you also don't want to sort of get too ahead of yourself because there can be a lot of drawbacks if you have too many people managing and not enough people doing. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about how you think about maybe two key inflection points. One, sort of introducing the first engineering managers, and then two, that VP of engineering hire.
Yeah. For the engineering managers, I always say like, hey, I always try to tell people, well, I think this is okay since this is Stytch family. I think one of the things I really was proud of is when Dimitri hired his first few engineers and transitioned them from engineering managers to EMs. He brought me and a few other advisors around the table to kind of help them kind of navigate that and get their sea legs. So I think of like that transition from like, I'm a believer in hire like that first engineering manager being in-house, because there's a lot of social capital that's been built. But what happens is they don't usually know the language or the sea legs, or particularly hard. And so I think it's super important that either the CTO to either get like outside help, and that could be like an advisor or a coach, to kind of bring that in. If the CTO has the skill sets and experience, then that's great, but sometimes it's not always the case. And so how do you augment that? Because oftentimes what happens is the CTO is trying to slay a dragon and doesn't have necessarily the responsibility or the time or the day to kind of help them navigate that ideal maze of how do I run a successful one-on-one. What I really like is that for people to either augment their cap table, that's maybe self-serving, self-serving a little bit, but like augment their cap table or advisors to kind of allow for that. We did this at Robinhood. I can't think of the gentleman's name, but one of the better engineering term managers that I work with brought up his name the other day. But anyway, we had paid. I think he had some kind of package or something like that. We had brought in. He was pretty good. I think there's a nice way to use your cap table to kind of plug that. I think oftentimes I tend to have high residence to high growth founders because they have a great Series A and C lead that might help with like product. They might have a C lead that's really good at 0 to 1, but they don't have anyone to help them navigate the engineering growth cycle. And I think that's one of the things I really like working with you and Reed, was that you were like, hey, please come now, help. And I think the self-awareness of the founders is super important to kind of navigate that. And so there's a few things you can do, right? You can, the CTO can kind of help drive that. If they have that experience, they can get outside help either through their investors or advisors, or just like naturally hold accountable for the individual IC and say, hey, listen, you can use my board, you can use my cap table. If there's a profile for someone you think that is best suited to kind of help you navigate this, let's get them involved, right? You have Chaitan on your board. I imagine Chaitan has an entire Rolodexes of individuals that would activate for your one of your, engineer managers or something like that. And that's the same thing across the org, right? I don't think there's anything that's unique to engineer manage the first product, engineer sales, et cetera, et cetera.
How you think about the right time to bring in a VP of Eng?
Last time someone asked me that, I said, do you need a VP of Eng or do you need a head of engineering? Those are two wildly different things. And understanding why you need a head of Eng versus a VP of engineering is very important. Because if you're not careful, if you're not ready for a VP of Eng, you get a lot of head of an Eng who want a VP title who are applying to that role. So you're seeing a lot of signal. And so for me, I think that the big question is like, do you need a head of Eng or do you need a VP of Eng, right? And a head of Eng is pretty high leverage for the most part. And one of the nice things is that you can get one, and then if they do well, they can get promoted to VP. And then the kind of natural next question is, how does the CTO think about their role and responsibilities towards that VP? versus a head of engineering. So the scope and responsibilities are wildly different. Depends on who the CTO, if they have one, wants to relieve that responsibility, right? Oftentimes, what happens is that the CTO actually wants to be more of an architect, and so bringing in the VP allows for them to kind of get leverage from the people and the EQ perspective. But sometimes, most of the time, I usually just say like you probably just need a head of an inch because you basically want a manager that can manage managers, right? Because the gap that actually gets you pretty far before kind of getting a VP of inch. Because what happens is you go out and get these fancy VP of inch, and they don't know how to operate inside of your ecosystem and they flounder, right? Or they don't even know how to hire. So if you got a VP of engineering who can't kind of hire 10 engineers, that's like a telltale sign. And so for me, that's kind of how I think about it. I tend not to be prescriptive in any of the counsel that I tend to get. The thing that I probably be more obsessed about is when you do hire a VP of engineering, being relentless about the 30, 60, 90 because I want it's your responsibility as the founder or CTO to be able to rip that band-aid off of that VP because I've seen so many engineering orgs like murdered because of bad VP advantage. So like less about kind of like whether if you can get someone running through the process. Oh, another thing is reference. I think so many people, I need a VP, I need a VP. Oh, this VP, insert your favorite tech company, is wants to work here. We need to do everything, give them this great economic package, hire them ASAP. And then they didn't even call references. Boy, let me tell you, you'd be surprised what you can kind of like. The valley is extremely so small that getting in front of the X directs and peers is so important. And I think actually what challenge that the average, I think that's where like the board can be very high leverage for you. Anytime you're hiring someone that's like a head of VP of engineering, or these executive, quasi executive, just kind of making sure you have the ideally you have an active and forward thinking board. And so one of the leverage of like I know it's cool not to have a board now, but one of the powers of having a board is actually giving you leverage to being because like referencing a VP of Angel is really hard because like looks good, they say all the right things, but like maybe some people are willing to be truthful to you, maybe not truthful to you, but they won't lie to Chaitin. And so kind of having that natural balance is pretty important there. So I think references, advisors, kind of smart people on the cap table that actually did the heavy lifting, and then kind of using your Rolodex to kind of help get that first transition to engineering manager to support. Because that's so, I mean, it's tough. Like everyone struggles. It's okay to struggle. But there's something special about when they transition out of that. They blossom. And then it sends a big, strong signal to all your engineers. Like there's like two things you want to be able to show that you can get promoted. Because if you're hiring too much external, then that's a bad signal you want to send. You want to be careful to let people know that they can get promoted and as staying as engineers. They don't have to go into management to thrive. But it's a great signal internally inside the company when you promote inside. I think a lot of startups don't do that enough.
Yeah, definitely. I think it is really important, especially as you're like growing super quickly as a company, and a lot of like growth personally just happens naturally as you're sort of like riding that wave, right? But people want to have like targets that they can be working towards, right? And feel like they're moving forward. And so having that sense of like progress, whether that be moving forward on a sort of IC technical track or moving into management is super important. So I'd love to change gears just a little bit. And I think one thing that you really spike in from my perspective is being a really great resource for candidates. And obviously, sometimes that can be beneficial for us if we're trying to sell a candidate and you're having really good conversations with them. But I also think it's just so valuable to have someone as an engineer evaluating a bunch of startups who can sort of peel back the curtain and give some perspective on how to evaluate all these different startup offers. One startup offer is going to look very different than another. And so there's so many things to think about. What's some of the advice that you give to people in your network that you're advising about how to choose the right startup to work at?
Don't go work on something stupid. First of all, I always get bummed when a great engineer that I admire so much goes and work for like Uber for pets. I'm like, I'm like, come on, there's so many great opportunities. And I think another thing is that they get that first inbox email and someone gets excited about them. I kind of challenge the talent, say, hey, why don't you kind of raise your hand and say like, hey, this is the first opportunity. This is interesting. Was this the best opportunity that I could present to me in today's climate right now based on the profile and things that I want to accomplish in my career over the next, 2 to 5 years. I think you raise your hand up and try to build up a top of funnel, but not too big, because I think what happens is there's a bit of like analysis paralysis that happen. And so I try to say like, hey, just be really thoughtful about curating a small set of people that you want to spend some time with. And I think that the thing that I like to think about is kind of challenge the talent to kind of open up that mirror and look back and say, okay, what's important to me? What am I trying to accomplish? Have an honest conversation about your risk profile. Does the money matter? Does it not? There's no right or wrong answer there. Do you value equity? Do you value career growth? Do you value impact? What are you trying to accomplish over the next like 2 to 5 years? And then naturally optimizing for that. And then I think another big thing is that start the founders. One of the nice things, if you go work with me, I can introduce you to all the founders. You don't have to kind of work through the messy middle of a lot of the organization, because I think a strong set of founders can really take a okay opportunity to a great opportunity, and take a great opportunity to an exceptional opportunity. And so the goal is to kind of put yourself around these talent magnets and these kind of special people that have a very sense clarity of thought, because you potentially could be working 40 to 60 hours a week with these individuals and having a lot of trust, and the person driving the ship is pretty important. As far as like most of the tactical things is that, people that I think what you kind of say, people that run a great process, people who you think are empathetic, people you think will allow you to have a high impact on the organization. I think that's what to optimize for. I think the thing I really admired was that I remember when I came from California, from Ohio, originally from Louisiana though. I was like, well, I think at Robinhood, I can go from being a mediocre engineer to a great engineer. And if the company goes to zero, I could always go work for Zuck. And so, like for me, I was like less optimized from the downside risk of the company going to zero, and more focused on the kind of the slope. I think more people, I would challenge most of the time I talk to people who are worried about joining an early stage startup, is I say you need to recalibrate your risk. I think people's risk feels very stagnant. And in fact, it's pretty interesting. So people more successful in their career, the less risk that they do. And I kind of challenge them, because I think the average person doesn't appreciate for how high their floor is. And then I think optimizing for your slope is so important, because that compounding, no matter where you're in your career, can be the difference of like, a natural compounding over a longer period of time. So yeah, I guess that's that. And then obviously I have a small set of highly biased set of founders that you could work with. And I think the thing why talent tends to really admire me or work with me or trust me, because my reputation is pretty good. I wasn't like turning water and wine with code, but I think a lot of people appreciated my thoughtfulness about business, about founders, about people who really have really good businesses. And like my commitment to the talent is that, look, things explode all the time, and I can't control those things, but my job is to kind of give you the information, the pros and cons, so that you can make an executive decision. And ultimately, if you get there and it doesn't actually work, and you join a company on my behalf, I'm willing to give anyone to get out of jail free card, right? And I'll stop my schedule and help them kind of get out. And I think kind of that willingness to focus on the talent versus the company or my underlying agenda, and being honest, kind of allows them to kind of trust and be more thoughtful and willing to kind of interact with the people and founders that I work with.
Amazing. What are some of the questions or things that you encourage candidates to dig into when they're, evaluating these different offers?
It's kind of weird, but in today's climate, I actually think as a looming term sheet is a pretty important conversation to have, because like the reason being is because the fair market value could shift very quickly over two weeks, just because some growth investors decide to get excited about the opportunity and trying to understand whether or not they're in the market or not. It's hard to know sometimes, because there's a lot of moving pieces there. But I think kind of having an honest conversation about whether or not they're, sharks in the water trying to chase their particular opportunity is pretty important. Two, I think there's like a tweet I said, I think kind of understanding like fair market value of the company, the last terms of the rounds, preference stack, and like all the kind of interesting financial things around the last fundraiser is pretty important. I think there's a lot of companies I remember. I remember, people who joined Uber like pre IPO. I was like, man, the perf stack is probably crazy over there. It's hard to even know what the common shares value at that company. And I remember the kind of thinking about that. So I think kind of whether or not there's a term sheet. Two, kind of think about the last structure, the last round. Three, actually, I don't think the average engineer joining the company appreciates or understands the levers around startup equity. So if they haven't been around the block and they don't really understand it, there's some great resources now to kind of explain that. And you can't expect the founding team to always hold your hand through that, but understanding that and then asking questions based on your understanding. And I think that actually is interesting. Some founders are more transparent than others. And I think that's a particularly strong signal, whether it's around, the progress of the business, whether they're sharing, like there's like some founders I work with who like share the charts and things like that to help people get comfortable with the validity of the business, kind of have an open conversation about the last fundraise, which isn't really that big of a secret because all of Silicon Valley already knows anyway. So it's not, why should you try to, it's not like it's like a not well kept secret. And then three, the human behavior, like trying to get a grasp of what though the founding team is optimizing for is in the consistency and like anytime you kind of see the two founders interact with each other, I think it's pretty important. I think that's one of the things I really admire is like I saw Reed and then I saw you separately. And then I was like, when I saw you together, I'm like, wow. It's like, it's just like, it's hard to explain, but you'd be surprised how much friction between founders. And I remember when I was talking to Reed, he was like, hey, I think this makes sense, but I have to go ask my partner, Julianna, to see if she's into that. And I really appreciate him pausing to kind of to make sure you were bought into something before committing to me. And so like those things like that are kind of random, but I think those are kind of like non-obvious things that matter. I think more people should be really understand the economics of their job offer, even if it likely will go to zero statistically speaking, but kind of understanding the knobs around that I think is pretty important. And then maybe lastly, especially for companies that are raising it high valuations, is trying to understand why did the investors get excited about that particular opportunity. And sometimes it's actually a really thoughtful exercise that isn't told in the TechCrunch or the blog post. That's the opportunity to kind of paint the story. At the end of the day, like I said, like a founder's job is to put you in the distortion field. If a founder can't put you in their founder distortion field, then it's probably not a good use of your time because I think that is how you tell like a difference between a good and a great founder set. It's like whether or not you're like I remember I used to tell people you should be leaning forward. Like when Juliana's talking to you, if you're not like leaning forward and getting excited about the opportunity, then and then you have questions about like the quality of the talent, et cetera, et cetera. Like ideally, you're like they're like a big talent magnet, and I think that's one of the things that's pretty unique about you, the team that you built over there, is that you hire some really great people, and that just naturally compounds. And someone that's like really focused on the slope of their career, they'll be able to grow, which I think is really nice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that piece around sort of joining for your own personal slope is so important. I think I'm here today because I joined Plaid and got to learn from so many amazing people there and just like grew personally at a rate that I didn't even know was possible. And so I think, yeah, at the end of the day, like you're going to spend a bunch of time working with these people, right? They should be people that you can learn from in the good times and bad times, because as much as startups sometimes seem like always up and to the right from the outside, obviously there's always going to be ups and downs. And like it's ultimately the people at the end of the day that are really what make it.
There's this my one of my favorite. I don't know if she actually wrote this in an article. She told me personally, but basically she would always tell me she was like, Jaren, no one learned anything from losing. And so there's something about winning, joining a winning team and learning how to win. You don't learn anything from losing, actually. So there's something special about learning, and I think that's why you have these mafias from these like PayPal's and like these other places. What happens is that once you learn how to win, once you know what talent looks like, you know what success looks like, you know what bad days look like. And so you have the entire spectrum. And I think that's is what kind of like the natural cheat code. So I think kind of not focusing, not optimize, like the money matters, but don't optimize under that curve, right? You should always negotiate and get market terms. That's what I tell everyone. But also understanding like you learn something, like there's something about winning, joining a winning team and learning how to win.
Yeah, absolutely. If people want to learn more from all of your wisdom, how can people find you? How should they get in touch with you?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, one, they should join Stytch, first of all. And then
Absolutely.
if they join Stitch, then they have access to me, easy access, all the access to me. I'm on Twitter. So Jaren Glover, you can kind of find me Jaren Glover everywhere, like on GitHub, on Instagram, on Twitter. My email, like all that is just really right there. But some of those methods of communication, I'm probably less active on. But I'm pretty active on Twitter. So if you tweet me, I'll probably be there. And then, for those who and I'm always willing to kind of hear anyone who's excited about like planting their own flag, starting something. I get excited. Like I love the 0 to 1, and I also think that I'm like uniquely capable and to kind of help people go through the hyper growth mode. So if anyone, whether they're like pre-seed or Series B, they think I can be helpful, and especially if they're friends of Reese and Juliana's, then they're friends of mine. All right.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much for joining us and sharing some of your great learnings.
Thank you. Thanks for all your hard work. And I'm excited for all the impact you're going to have and value you're going to create for your customers.
Amazing. Thank you.